Okay, we're going to get started. Looks like everybody's got some food. I've been told I need to speak up, so I'll do that. And if you can't hear me now, you won't hear me then. So I think we're good to go. So welcome to STG. I think I recognize almost everybody here. If I don't, sorry. If you don't work here, then I don't feel quite as bad about that. But Christian, Khayyam, and I went to React Rally, and so we're going to come talk to you a little bit about how great the conference was and brag about all the swag we got. And we got the shirts, we got some socks, we got stickers. And if we have time after that, we'll tell you a little bit of what we learned. And this just told me to take a 2-minute break, so I'm going to stand here for 2 minutes. Is this okay? All right, Christian's musician. I don't know what's going on. So just a quick summary. 2-day conference. They had 21 different speakers talking on all kinds of things. While it is a React conference, they don't focus exclusively on React. But lots of attendance here in Salt Lake. Had great snacks, great swag, like I said. And something that really impressed me about this conference, they actually made a big effort to make sure that it was accessible to anybody that wanted the content. So they streamed it live. They had some live text transcription, big old monitors with, the text just flying up there. I've never seen anybody type that fast. They said it was like 180, 200 words a minute, just running along live with the speaker. And they were like, almost, I saw like one typo the whole 2 days. It was amazing. So whoever those guys are, they're awesome. The code for the site that they put together is up there on GitHub for people to learn from. They post all the recordings on YouTube, write that down immediately, or we can post it with the recording and everything. And then most of the speakers threw their slides up afterwards. So there's those, and we'll put it in the recording description.
Can you go back to the page?
Yeah, we'll post it. I was kidding about writing it down. I think some of those O's are zeros and Gaelic something or other. So again, they covered a ton of topics. We picked a couple to deep dive into. And I figured where we're so diverse in all the different things we do. We got front end, we got QA, we got business analysts, devs. I was just going to hit 2 or 3 points from every talk real fast so that you can go, oh, that's one I want to learn about, one I don't, and hopefully pick up a few things along the way. Really, there were only 2 or 3 that were like entirely React specific, which I've highlighted there in italics with little asterisks. So that's a big list. I'm going to look through it fast, and then Christian and Khayyam will have time to dive a little deeper. So talk 1 was from a member of the Chrome Dev Teams tools. They talked about how frameworks have changed the way that they're building the browser and the tools around the browser. If you do React or Angular, you're probably familiar with the DevTools plugins. They're working on building those directly into the browser more, where they've got more native support for all the things that these frameworks do for you, like components. They're even considering baking them into the HTML spec, so that instead of having jQuery or React or whatever, you just have a native type ahead input or an accordion or things like that. So that it's enough of an impact that they're going, maybe all browsers need this. So that's a little taste of where things might go. Second talk was about front-end app bundles. Has anybody heard of those? That one was brand new to me. So the idea is that where we've got all these different dynamic languages targeting the same thing, you come up with this package format, FABs or Fab or whatever you want to call it, where you pre-package all that stuff and deliver it to the browser almost like an installer. Like you would have on a phone. If that's something that you're interested in, I'm actually going to be talking about progressive web apps, which is sort of similar, in a couple weeks. So this was interesting to me that you could, I would want to define this standard where you can build everything and deploy it to the same place. So that standard would be supported across all those different hosts. It would handle all of your updates, your caching, your everything as if it were a native application. I heard Blazer in there. We'll talk about that. Third talk was a designer who went over some of the reasons for dynamic storytelling over static. He's got the slide there with all the different pieces of his talk. He started off doing a video presentation on some climate considerations. I mean, he was a good 4 minutes in before I realized I was watching a website and not a video that had been pre-compiled, you know, in After Effects or whatever. So all of that was totally dynamic, blending SVG elements, animating everything, and it just all broke down to little components and animations together. So I was surprised at how much you could do with that, and it made me rethink how I'm doing some of my UI, where I need to blend and leave the user a little more, and frankly just play with SVG, because there's a lot of fun things you can do there. And by the way, stop me at any time if you've got more questions or want to hear a little more about some of these.
Yeah, about the SVG blending between views.
Yeah.
Did you look at the underlying code? How does that work? Does it actually merge apps and whatnot live in the browser or something?
Yep. Yeah, so he actually went through a little bit of the math. A lot of the math he stole from some existing libraries, but he demoed exactly how he's blending some of it. So like that bottom left one where you've got the circle that's like sunsetting into the ground, he went through exactly how he figured out what the path should be, where you're calculating the tangents and the arcs between these things, and then that's all abstracted away, where you just go, I want a circle, I want it to blend to this thing, move them together, and it just handles it seamlessly. So if you want to dig into the details on that, go find that doc. Number 4, internationalization. So React has made a huge effort to make sure that the framework is available to everyone. This was a talk from one of their documentation people. They support over 40 different languages, and they originally had spreadsheets like everybody else that were always out of date. And they built out a system where they can take the individual files, automatically run them, track the changes that have been made in the app, which ones are out of date, which exact items need to be updated in Swahili or whatever, and then it automatically integrates those tools through Git changes, merges them into their CI/CD pipeline, and automatically redeploys, the 40 different versions of the site. And all they have to do is, just put the translation in, and they're done. It's kind of funny listening to her. She figured out, how to script this, and she actually got banned for a while from the GitHub API because they were loading so much through the pipeline. And they called them up and said, "What are you doing?" Like, okay, let's teach you the right way to do this. But fifth one, performance tuning. So a little bit about UX design, what makes something feel slow versus actually being slow, using animation and loading to help lead the user along, help them feel like it's moving along properly. And then some of the key things that actually affect your render time, and all the tooling in the browser that supports that. So he's got a little live audio editing app that he threw up there, where it's generating sound files, it's tweaking them, it's equalizing, and it's all running perfectly smooth, 60 frames a second. So I have a pretty good idea what he's talking about. Next one was from a nonprofit guy here in Utah. He's a full-time coder and said, I want to go do something that is really helping the world a little more. So it's called Just Utah Coders. They connect people with tech skills with nonprofits. They're trying to help establish changes or help some group that has no funding, whatever it is. A couple of the examples he gave were people trying to get through immigration legally. Helping them with the paperwork, all the different requirements, connecting them with translators, things like that. Another one was court summons, where people get, a small moving violation or whatever, and then never show up to court because they don't understand it. It escalates till they're in jail. And so helping them walk through the process, make sure they check all the boxes, get out, stuff like that. So if you're looking for something to do with your skills to build out your portfolio or just want to get involved, this is a great resource. Animation. Anybody here do data visualization with D3 or React or anything at all? No? Nobody? All right. I personally like it. It was fun to see how the two different ones worked and the different patterns you can use there. They had a whole talk on accessibility. I think Khayyam's going to dive into this one more. Is that a question? Or
no.
Just, okay. So they've worked really hard with React to make everything accessible. So A11Y you'll see sometimes is this shortcut because that's just too long to spell, right? The guy who gave this talk actually had one arm. I can barely code with 2 arms, so good for him. And so he went into some of the proper patterns to use, things to look out for, like color contrast, making sure it works with screen readers, things like that. So talk specifically on observables, which aren't strictly part of React. Anybody used reservables? Observables? I can't. That thing I can't talk. So it's a really good way to stream all the different things you're handling, decouple stuff. So there's a good deep dive there if you want to go learn about that. So everybody been hearing about the 10x developer lately? So a lot of Twitter comments on it. There's been books written about it and so forth. So this is a 10-year-old kid who said, well, 10x must mean years, right? I can do anything anybody else can do. He gave a really good talk, actually, where he walked through and said, okay, I got into Scratch, my dad's a programmer, and then I wanted to do more. I started learning JavaScript, I got into React. So he went through and demoed out how to build a React app. It was as good of a tutorial as I've ever seen on it. So if you want to get your kids into it, or just show them what's possible, maybe show them that. If you're going to use it to be like, hey, you need to step up and work harder, consider that a 10-year-old kid was talking on your topic at an international conference and you weren't, so maybe don't push that too hard. 11, this one was just kind of a fun run through some bad ways to do UI and then exercising some of the things in the browser we don't get to play with. So you've got the Canvas API, dragging stuff around. The identification of those numbers there is with machine learning where you're running it off to some other service. So a lot of funny things where you go, I would never do that. How would I do that? A talk on lambda calculus, which was actually a pretty good introduction to it. It's one of those things where it goes right over my head, and that's fine, and I don't want to do tons of it, but if you want to learn this and understand why languages work the way they do, that's a really good one. If I have the time at the end, I'm going to let those guys do their part, but if I can come back, I'm going to talk a little more about WebAssembly. Anybody heard of WebAssembly? Anybody used it? One. With Blazor? Okay. So basically it's pre-compiled binaries that run on top of the JavaScript engine, although they can run everywhere. But they're binary. You can compile it from any language, just about, and run it natively in the browser. So you don't have to know JavaScript to build out a web app. There's a talk on building the Firefox debugger. Went through quickly the history of debugging, what breakpoints are actually doing. I didn't realize where that came from, but back in the day they used to literally have the machine running along, and when it got to where they wanted, they'd yank the wire off and break that point. And the machine would stop and they'd check everything and go, all right, keep going. So a lot of little nuggets like that. And then the Firefox dev tools are actually built with React, so they went through how they instrumented that, how they used it to debug itself, a little bit Inception style. This one was really fun. I think they're going to go into this one a little more too. So the guy, I guess, talked last year about state machines, what they are, and then this year he demoed how he used state machines to map out the entire workflow of an app. Say, okay, you can go from this state to this state, and then ran it through a script that generated all the possible paths, all the actions needed to take them, basically generated his entire unit integration test suite, ran it in the browser, snapshotted it with Puppeteer, and instead of, I think maybe it can do this, you suddenly have a well-defined machine that goes, here's everything that can happen, here's the snapshots, here's the screenshots and the steps of the things you weren't expecting. So that's one that I'm going to go back and watch again because I was just too much to take in all at once. So 16 design systems. Primer is the one that GitHub has developed internally. This was a really good talk on why you would have a design system, how the components help you structure your app, how you move things around. So it's similar to Google's Material or Bootstrap. So she discussed a lot of things about why they made certain decisions that I'd never thought about that helped me go, okay, I need to program a little bit differently this way, and here's how this can solve my problems. One on React pitfalls, I think you're going to cover this one. So I'll just real quickly that all the cool kids are doing it. If you've talked to a front-end dev that does React in the last year, you've probably heard the term React hooks, and we'll go into more about that. Really good talk on code as a user interface. So we're sometimes limited by the language that we have to communicate with our users through our programs, or to communicate with the computer through the languages we have. Just as an example, who did JavaScript 10 years ago and really, really loved it? Nobody. It was rough. So it was slapped together in a week and languished for almost 20 years. And then who's done it in the last 5 years with all the new stuff that's come flying in? You like that a little better? So huge changes. They've got proper scoping, they've got promises, try catch, error handling, async, await, concurrency. Makes all your dreams come true. And so the improvements there really make it a better language for us to achieve things we want to do with any language. So that was a good insight into that.
Can you elaborate on the 610?
Yeah, so ES is ECMAScript, that's the specification. So version 1 came out in 1997. Version 2 and 3, a few years later, 4 was kind of abandoned. It wasn't until 2015 that we got ES5. So almost 20 years. So if you hop on Wikipedia, you can see exactly which features came in where. But all of the good features really have showed up in the last 5 years, where the let keyword where stuff's scoped properly, async await, things like that.
I didn't know that it was based on any actual data or project management, that they would only get 10 and 5 years.
Yeah, they're just released a new spec every year now, I think. So 10 was released in June. It didn't really have any major changes. But yeah, version 6 to 10 have been released in the last 5 years. That's all I know by that.
I didn't know it was that fast.
Yeah, it's been moving fast. And of course, the web has been that much easier to work with. So really, I just wanted to put the picture up that this guy posted, because I just love that. So it talked about how tracing lets you drill all the way through your app, see the flow of data from your database all the way through, rather than just reading out log files. How to use tracing to identify not just this line of code did this, but this event led to this stack of things that happened, and I need to follow it all the way through. I think Khayyam's going to talk about that one too. And almost we're getting to the end here. One on the evolution of computers, the history, the background. I'm maybe a little more into this than some other people. I like the mechanical stuff. This is actually a really good talk on why some of the things we do now are the way they are, where they came from. Why do we have an 80-character wide screen? Well, because the early punch cards that were driving these automated looms had 80 characters. So they picked that, said, oh, that's a good standard. We've got these cards. And then when later on there's a company that said, oh, we want to automate the U.S. Census. We're going to use these cards that they came up with. 80 characters wide. They're already making them. We'll grab a stack of those and run with it. 20 years later, that company became IBM. So this is actually, the lady that gave this did a lot of things about textiles and crochet and knitting and other stuff, and how the instructions for that are very similar to the instructions in code, because they have a common history. So if you want your wife or your grandma or whoever that's into knitting to watch something about computer science with you, this would be a really good one. And you might learn something about knitting too. And the last one was on architecting for users, about keeping in mind, the human side of things, that we need to build things that people can use in a way that meets their needs, and not just because the framework lays it out this way. So the accessibility, things like that. So, and then he threw up, here's all the different ways I could think of last night, as I was staying up too late, of how you could build something. And
crystal programming language.
Yeah, there's some pretty good ones in there. And the sad thing is, there's a few of those where you go, oh, no, I know a guy who did that. So that was just a good, fun overall talk. So if we have more time, we'll come back and talk about WebAssembly a little bit, but I'll pass over to Christian.
Can we give a hand for Brian?
Okay, just a moment here. Transitioning to Keynote. Let's see if this works. It almost worked. Okay. Awesome. My name is Christian. I also went to React Rally. I also have a React Rally shirt. Khayyam didn't wear his today because he's not a team player. Just kidding. And I'm doing mine on React Hooks Pitfalls, which was given by Kent C. Dodds. I'm basically just going to steal his whole speech. So if you think it's good, it's all him. So, number one, first pitfall. Actually, real quick, how many of you have worked with React Hooks, like actually used it? Okay, good amount. About half of you, a little more than half. So these are just some things to avoid when working with hooks. I thought this was especially useful as hooks just came out and seemed like a good React Rally opportunity to dive more into hooks. And like Brian mentioned, a lot of the talks didn't actually have to do particularly with React, but this one, of course, is directly with React. So that's partly why I chose this one. But yeah, number one, the first pitfall to avoid, starting without a good foundation. So you just want to jump right into hooks and you just try it right away. Kent would advise that you read the docs. The docs are great. React docs are known to be really well documented, really clear and usable. And so if you head over to reactjs.org, you can see all the documentation, add/hooks, and there are your hooks. The FAQs as well, same website obviously, can answer a lot of common questions. Kent Dodds, who gave this talk, also has an Egghead course where he walks through just hooks in general. So stuff like that is really great. And the other reason I chose this as a talk is because I have a course that actually just came out yesterday. It was really good timing. But I don't know how many of you have used Scrimba.com, but if you go to Scrimba.com, it'll be the first big course you see on there. It's Learn React Hooks in an hour. It's $9, I believe. And if you want to learn hooks quickly and efficiently and build a cool Paint app, like Microsoft Paint, then you can go there and check that out. So that is another way to dive in. But basically the idea here is don't just go attempt it without reading up a little bit on how hooks work, why are we transitioning from hooks, etc. Number two, not using the ESLint plugin. So there was an ESLint plugin made specifically for hooks that enforces two things. They are the rules of hooks and exhaustive dependencies, which I'll go into right now. They recommend that you would use this ESLint plugin, and I would highly recommend it as well, and set the rules of hooks to error and exhaustive depths to warn, just because with linting technology it can't always detect every case correctly. But let's just go into these ESLint rules real quick. Number one, the ESLint rules of hooks. If you're not familiar with the two main rules of hooks, the first one is it must be at the top level. So here we have a use effect hook, which isn't filled in, but you get the idea. We have it inside an if block. Not allowed. Don't do that. ESLint will tell you if you do that. So go ahead and use ESLint. And also the second the second hooks rule is that it must be in a React function, which I've never actually accidentally did that, but ESLint will tell you about it, so why not use it? So I'd highly recommend that. And then the other ESLint rule that will enforce for you is exhaustive dependencies. And this one is a little bit trickier. It's not quite as obvious as those other ones. So if we look at an example here of a functional component, we're using use state rather, with accounts, just a simple count, and we have use effect, which is going to change the title of the document, so what you see in your tab, to whatever the count is, and then what we're rendering is a button that when you click it, it'll increase the count by 1. The issue with this code is you'll see as the second argument to use effect, we pass in an empty array, and this is a common practice to say, hey, I only want this effect to run when this component first runs, initializes. The array of dependencies is an array of things that, hey, whenever any one of these changes, I want this effect to run again. And since we put nothing in there, we're saying, I don't want this effect to run again. Well, what's the issue with that? Obviously, when we change the count, that effect won't run again. So you have an issue where you're using the count state inside the use effect, and yet you're not putting it in the array of dependencies. Sometimes the bug is not as clear as this example. Like you might look at it and say, oh, I don't need to put that in the array of dependencies. If that changes, I don't need to rerun this effect, so I'm going to optimize and not rerun it. But ESLint can tell in certain situations where we might miss. And so it'll point that out to you and say, hey, you should put count in here. And when Kent C. Dodds gave this, he basically gave the analogy of it's kind of like Dan Abramov whispering in your ear. It's like, do it this way. Well, that's a good way to think about it. So put the count in the array of dependencies and you're good to go. So once again, just overview, that's number 2 pitfall. Use the ESLint plugin. Number 3 pitfall, thinking in life cycles. So if you're coming into React hooks from classical class components, it might be a little more challenging actually to understand how hooks work because they're a totally different mindset. We tend to think still in the life cycles of component did mount, component did update, component will unmount, and it's actually more helpful when you're looking at hooks to just get out of that mindset. We're not thinking in life cycles anymore. This first slide I put up was not given in Kent Dodd's talk, but it's a tweet that came to mind when I was looking at this. When Dan Abramov originally gave the presentation of hooks for the first time at React Conference, he kind of gave a comparison of 2 pieces of code, one without hooks and one with hooks. And then someone else kind of color-coded it so it's more obvious where the benefit of hooks comes in. So on the left-hand side, you can see a class component with all this stuff going on, and the colors represent related logic. So all the blue stuff is related, all the purple stuff is related. With hooks, on the right side, you can see that, oh, they're all nicely coupled together where they should be. And so this is just a good visualization of seeing how hooks help us. We're getting away from lifecycle methods, and we're caring more about what each thing does and how it's all related. And this is a tweet that Kent actually did put in his talk. The question is not, when does this effect run? The question is, with which state does this effect synchronize with? So if you're using useEffect, for example, when you pass in just a function, oh, so you care about all state. In other words, anytime any state changes, this effect is going to run. If you put in an empty array, you're saying nothing should make this effect run again. And then, of course, if you're putting something in the array, you're saying these pieces of state should make the effect run again. So when we're thinking in hooks, we're really caring about what affects this particular function. What is going to change that means this needs to change? What's going to change that will trigger this change? So we're just trying to synchronize different functions and different things that are happening. So that's a really helpful way to think about it. I found that when I first came to hooks, I thought about it in lifecycle methods and tried to map like, okay, so use effect with no array is kind of like updates every time. Use effect with an empty array is kind of like component did mount. But just get away from all that and just think of functions. So number 4, a pitfall when approaching React hooks is overthinking performance. This is easy to do. So here's a comparison. Think about which one might be more performant. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the use callback hook, but it essentially is a function that we can use to say, hey, we don't need to create this function every time. So you can see the first example does not use the use callback hook. We're setting up our count state just as before. Our second variable there, handle click, is a function. And then we're returning a button, we're rendering a button that when you click it, it will update the count. Problem being, every time we update the state, we know that our component re-renders, right? So you update the state, your component re-renders. And that means we're going to be declaring this handle click function every time it renders. And we don't need to do that. Handle click function never changes. It's always going to be the same function. So why do we keep redeclaring it? So you might think to yourself, this is where use callback hook comes in. And in that second example, you can see we've wrapped our function with the use callback hook, and we're saying, okay, we only want to declare this function one time. We're just going to use the same function every time. That way we don't need to redeclare it. And also, if we were to pass that function itself down into a child component, which is a pure component, then that pure component can work as it should. Because if you're passing a function down into a pure component that's supposed to only change when its props change, well, your function is technically the same. It's actually a new function object, so that pure component will think it's getting new props. So this is kind of the usual approach. But Kent's point was, when you introduce this use callback hook, you're doing kind of a give and take. There's some trade there. You might be I put the emphasis on might be saving some performance. You might not. because one, you're introducing another function that needs to be called. You're also introducing an array of dependencies. You know, these things do take memory. But two, I think what he'd focus on more is you're introducing added complexity. And so we also need to, whoops, sorry. I definitely should have disabled that. Now I can't find it. Oh man. My apologies. Here we go. Okay. Gotta take a break. No. So the second issue being if you are trying to optimize to a point where this code becomes more complicated, is it worth the performance savings? How much cost does it really take to be declaring this function every time? And so this is like a common worry that a lot of people have when they see hooks for the first time, is they see this pattern of we're going to declare this function, and then they realize, oh wait, every time this renders, we're going to redeclare this function. It's the same thing. Why do you keep doing that? That's going to incur performance costs. But it's not a huge performance hit, and using hooks in general over the performance hit that you get from setting up classes can sometimes be beneficial as well. So the point there is don't overthink performance. So how do we do that? Well, Kent gave a couple tips. Measure first, then optimize. So measure how your app is doing. Is it lagging at some point in the code? Okay, once you see poor performance, once you see something going wrong, then you can optimize at that point. Another tip is, like I said, consider both performance and complexity. So don't just be so focused on performance that you're forgetting about what later readers or your own future self will see when they look at your code. Will they be able to understand it, or is it just going to unnecessarily complicate things? Because with the use callback hook, as you saw, we're introducing some complexity that we wouldn't have had otherwise, such as that array of dependencies, which we need to manage and make sure that we have the right dependencies in there. Okay, one last pitfall, and that would be testing implementation details. If any of you know or are familiar with Kent Dodds, he's kind of become the testing guy of the React world, so he had to give something about testing, of course. But his basic last pitfall that he gave was that when we're using hooks, we shouldn't be testing the implementation details, because hooks are an implementation detail. What do I mean by implementation detail? I mean the way that you accomplish something. An end user doesn't care how, that you named your variable update counts. He doesn't care what you named the variable. He doesn't care how you went about updating the count. He just knows that when he clicks the button, the count should update. So don't test the implementation details. Rather test what the function or what the app should do. Another way to think about this, test in a way that works with classes or hooks. So as you're coming to hooks, write your tests in a way that isn't dependent on hooks alone, because once again, hooks are just an implementation detail. They're just a way that you're using to accomplish a task. So test in a way that is right in line with how your software will be used. That's a third point there. And yeah, any questions about any of those pitfalls, hooks-related things? I kind of rushed through that, sorry.
So, unrelated to the topic, I think you're one of those things that pops up or says, hey, restaurant, time for a break.
I use a Chrome extension. I just searched on the Chrome extension store for break timer or something like that. It was like the first one.
Nice.
And that's what I use. So.
I'm not download that.
If you search a Commodore, there's many different timers for that.
Yeah.
You say, I've been working for this long, and I might need to do
Yeah.
this.
So that is it. Yep. And with that, I will welcome Khayyam. Thank you.
All right. It's kind of cool to see React hooks. I was just at the React meetup down in Lehigh yesterday, and they had a talk about React hooks, and they're being used in all sorts of ways. So pretty cool. All right. I'm going to go over and summarize a couple of the talks more in depth, much like the React hooks. My first talk that I want to summarize is the one that dealt with the accessibility. So it is pronounced alley. I did not know that until React Rally. I always wondered what A11Y meant, and I knew it had something to do with accessibility, but the theory that was presented was that between the A and the Y there are 11 letters, And so you have Ali. So, didn't know that. All right. This is something that I had not paid attention to until a couple weeks ago. I knew it was out there, but how many of you are making your websites truly accessible? Okay, that's about where I was at too. I knew it was out there, I knew it helped, I knew that if you had a screen reader that it would kind of do some stuff, but I didn't really know much about it, didn't really pay attention to it. But answer this question, or just think to yourself, actually don't think to yourself, I want to actually know. How many people in the US do you think have some sort of disability, that are facing some kind of disability and where this would be affecting them?
35%. 25%.
35, 25.
Probably a lot higher older people who are having issues with their eyes, we're going to include that.
Okay.
By contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, according to the CDC, it's 26%. That's the official number. But as you think about it, as people get older, right, they're starting to have some issues with their eyes, being able to see smaller print or some of these other things. And I don't know that those are necessarily considered disability, but they do factor into the person who's using your website. So being aware of this, now I'm sitting here, I'm developing for a company, we're doing an in-house app, they're going to use it, you know, on desktops, we're not worried about mobile, our project doesn't have any accessibility in it. We have not paid attention to it at all. And this talk hit me because while I was working on this app, I heard the talk, one of the bugs that came up was, hey, I cannot tab through your basic form. We don't have a lot of forms in our site. We have 2 basic forms. And one of them is just a drag and drop, this is the file I want to use. The other form is the only other one, and you can't get through it with the keyboard. You have to use a mouse to get through the keyboard. So what if you can't see, or what if you don't have a mouse? What do you do? So this one really brought it home to me. So a couple of the disabilities that really are affected by, or that are addressed by Ali, are blind people, right? They can't see how amazing you added your pixel perfect whatevers. Small print. If your site's blown up to 200% so that someone can read it who's having problems focusing, what will your site look like? Will it still format okay? Will it still be readable? Will it just go become a jumbled mess?
Isn't that built into the browser now? There was a function in there for making things more readable.
Well, you can zoom, but with that, the browser also readjusts, and so things push, and your site might adjust in a way that you're not expecting it if you haven't paid attention to it. So yes, it does, but maybe not the way you want it to. Colorblind. I hadn't even thought about that one. Although I have several family members who have this issue. I don't, so I don't think about the contrast between a red and a green, right? Or some of these other contrasts. So, and then I already mentioned, you know, what if you can't use a mouse? What if you struggle with that and you use the keyboard to navigate your site? And at the rally, they showed several different sites where they tried to just tab through. Some elements are completely inaccessible, like my site was. There's just various issues that come up that you don't pay attention to all the time. So anyway, yeah.
I was actually taught when I first broke into coding HTML that designing your website should have at least some semblance of light in the website, whether it's the text color or the background color.
Okay. And that may be a good way. Again, I'm not the Ali expert, but having white in your background or having it somewhere in there might be a good design thing. But that's actually some of the things that we need to start thinking about. Accessibility isn't just about, can I navigate the site without a mouse, or it's not just, it's this whole encompassing idea that starts even before you start your first line of code. Okay? So, your design. You know, is this going to be accessible? Is this something that people can use? Colors. You know, again, contrasts. You know, they showed an example. How many of you use the dev tools, your Chrome dev tools? Okay? If you're not using those, that was a talk. We should, you know, be using DevTools. But anyway, some of the colors in the DevTools are not accessible. So if you're colorblind and you're trying to look at the different time streams on your network tab or something, you can't necessarily tell what's happening where. You just see lines. I hadn't even thought about that. I'm not responsible for programming that, but you know, it was just one of the examples. Navigation, screen readers. They did a quick example of, hey, have you ever listened to your site on a screen reader? They did an example, and you heard it read the site, and it read everything. And they added in a few of its own things because it's like, hey, navigation, blah, 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 and it would start talking. And so telling it what to say made a lot of sense. Now, I don't know how many people, you know, for my particular app are going to be using a screen reader necessarily. But again, it's something we need to think about if you have a public-facing site. Somebody out there is probably going to use your site with a screen reader. What's going to happen to their experience? Okay.
It became an issue in all the companies I worked at when they got sued. That's the main reason.
Absolutely. They showed an example of Domino's. Domino's Pizza. They're getting sued. They're one of those people getting sued because their site wasn't accessible for blind screen readers and such. And so Domino's actually launched a countersuit saying it's not right for you to force us to make our site accessible. I don't know if that's the right approach to accessibility. I mean,
Blind people don't deserve pizza.
I know, like, yeah, blind people don't eat pizza. I don't think I know that one. So, you know, it's one thing to say, oh, I didn't realize my site's not accessible. Let's take care of it. Let's make it accessible. That's another thing to say, well, we're not going to. So what are you going to do about it? Yeah.
I think it mainly comes from the guidelines aren't set by the government at all. You know, the web accessibility guidelines is just non-governmental organization. So I think most of the corporations have been arguing whose guidelines should we follow and is it reasonable for those guidelines.
Right. So, you know, who sets the guidelines? Is it reasonable? Those are all valid questions. But the overarching principle is, I think we should be having this idea in mind, thinking about accessibility and paying attention to it. You know, do we have to do everything that makes the site accessible? No. But should we do a few things that make sense? Should we be able to tab through a form? That's probably a decent design just in general. You know, can you navigate? How many of you use keyboard shortcuts when you're programming? Okay, so you use them. Don't you think that the users of your program should be able to use them? I mean, simple things like that just make sense. I don't know the full extent, and I don't know everything that goes into being completely accessible. But there are some things that make sense. Do you have a question or comment?
I was just consider there actually are some national standards for accessibility, things like font size and minimum contrast between colors and stuff that are, I think, legally binding. On larger companies at least. There's some really good tools on the web you can find where you're putting your color scheme and logo. Now you're only this % different between your text and your background, and you can change it to this. Like that.
Okay.
So you don't have to come up
So there are different guidelines. Some of them are more binding than others. But again, I'm not here to tell you follow any set of guidelines. My whole reason for summarizing this talk is to say, hey, let's be aware. Let's start paying attention to this, at least at some level, right? So, how accessible is your site? Well, there's a couple ways to tell based on some of these guidelines. And again, I don't know who set any of these, but I know that there are some tools that help you say, hey, here's some basic guidelines. So there is an accessibility tab in your Chrome DevTools. How many knew that? Couple? Okay. So over there in that far corner, in your Elements tab, your General tab, under the Specifics, there's a little Accessibility tab you can click. And it will start to tell you the accessibility, the nature of your accessibility and how accessible it is based on that specific page. So that's already built in. You don't have to do anything extra or special. You just click the button and there it is. Okay? The second thing is that there is an Audit tab in your DevTools. And inside of that Audit tab, you have the accessibility features. So if you click on your Audit tab, down there, you just click the box that says Accessibility, and then when you hit run audits, it will check the accessibility of the page that you're on. So when you do that, it will give you a whole series of feedback of things that, everything from color contrast to do you have your input labels labeled. Just a ton of stuff there.
So your alt tags.
Right, alt tags on your images, those kind of things, absolutely. Okay, there's also the ASP extension, and I knew there was something out there. I didn't know what it was until the rally here. But you can just go to Chrome DevTools, get your ASP extension. This is kind of what it looks like when I pulled it up on my site just to see what does it look like, and it adds it into your DevTools as another tab that you can use. And then I already put up there your ESLint plugin. You have an Ali plugin that's available, and that goes with whichever developer tool you're using. So like I use VS Code, but there are several others out there that have something similar. So those are some of your tools. And there I go. See, I got it installed. I'm taking steps. All right. If you want more resources on Ali, there's the Ali project. Their website is being redesigned apparently, because I took this picture last night this morning. So they're getting some things updated, but they also have a thing on GitHub that you can go to and take a look. So if you do want to really figure some of these things out, this is probably the best resource for you. And then you have those other resources already built in for testing. So that's Ali. The other one, the other talk that I wanted to go over real quick, quick, before we go farther, is there any questions on Ali that I might be able to answer? Okay, so at least as you're as overwhelmed as I was, we're good. All right. The second one I'll have to go through just real quickly because we're running low on time. This was following the full stack trace. So the question that this talk tried to answer was, how can we make it easier to do our job and understand what it is that we're doing? You come into a new project. Now, hopefully you're all in the same boat and you've moved project and you get to the new project. How do you get up and running? How do you know what's happening? How do you know how to evaluate this project when you get there? And there's different ways to do that. You jump in, you start, playing with the app, you load it up, whatever, you start getting into the modules or whatever, and that gets you started. But there's some other tools that help us get that. So, a couple of the tools. You have your browser console. And if you're using Redux, not every project does, but that's one that Redux or that React has and uses quite a bit, is the access to Redux. And so Redux has already some built-in tools where you can kind of see the actions and the payloads, when is it happening, what's changing, and you have this ability to go through the time in your app and go through each step and see what part of my state updated as you go. What was the information I was given, and how did that update my state? So that's one tool. The second tool are your networking tools. When you do any kind of update and you make some requests, you can see what requests are made, what XHR requests go out there, what comes back. You can see the whole 9 yards. See how big that resource is, how long did that resource take, and so you start to see something like this, right, where all the different resources are requested or whatever. On the far side, you see the size. You see how long it took. You can kind of see that in relation to when did each thing load and where are your bottlenecks. So it starts to give you some good information there. Third thing, and this is more for those on the back end, right? Your server logging. So I know about it. I've even done it before, but that's not one of the things I do a ton. So I borrowed this server log from the example at React Rally. And it just shows you all the different things that went through the back end, the different requests, the GET, the POST, the mongoose request, and just where it happened there. So all of these are good. They all give you a different picture and tell you different things that are happening inside of the app at any given moment. But the trick is there a way to pull these all together into a single spot so you know exactly what's happening? And that was the whole point of this idea of this distributive tracing, or this full stack trace. The idea here is simply that you take these different actions, and each action happens in a span. Each span has a time that it started, it has a time when it ended, and you have that length of time in between. How long did this take? And if it's set up like these guys do it, right, then you have a unique trace ID, meaning this action started everything, so this is my unique trace ID, and then that ID is attached to every other aspect of the process of what requests were made, what was updated, when did this end, what other things were trying to happen at the same time as this thing was processing, and you have that all together. When you get it set up, you can end up with a little picture that's more like this one, where it shows you all the different requests. When Redux started doing something, when Express started doing something, when Mongoose started doing something in this case, right? All of these different things happened. This is how long it took, and you can see how everything is working in relation to each other. And that's what kind of got me excited. Hey, I can see where everything's happening. I can see where the bottleneck is, what happens, where everything stops, or what's taking a very long time. The trick, though, is how do you set this up? Backend it's been established for a little while, but how do you do this for the front end? The answer, just like on the back end, is middleware. You need to hook up middleware, something that kind of takes your action, does something before it. Here's an example, right? You have your action, you do whatever pre-work, which in this case would be starting your tracing. Then you do the action thing that you initially planned to do. And then when that action is all done, when it's finished, then you have whatever needs to be done to end that. So in a distributive trace, you would do something like this. You would start your span, you get the starting time, you identify the action, and you give it a unique ID. If it has one, you use it. If it doesn't have one, you assign it. Then the next. You do the thing, whatever that action is supposed to be. And when that action is completed and done, then you can finish that collection of that span, and now you have it all nice and neat and logged. And you can do this tying it into your backend with a plugin. Same kind of a thing. You're going to, well, the third one, .use, right? That's your middleware on your backend, which is a very common pattern. And so the plugin itself would just be something like this, a trace plugin, give an ID so that it knows every action on the back end can be related to this ID. And that way you tie the front end actions with the back end actions so you have a complete picture, full stack. Now, these guys, Jaeger, have started doing this on the front end. Back end, of course, like I said, already a mature technology. It's being used already. But on the front end, it's a little trickier because you have to decide where do you stick this in? Where does that middleware fit? In React, right, do we go to the lifecycle hooks? Tie into that? No, you're absolutely correct. You don't do that because, one, every React hook doesn't react the same way on each component. You have the parent component might have some hooks here. A child component has a different set of hooks that are running. A sibling component has its own set. They all run at different times. You can't tie in to just React, so to speak. So then you tie it into every single action, every click event. Well, that would become overly laborious to try to tie it in. So there's got to be some place in the middle where you can do it. You don't usually have a problem with the click event. And when it's done, you don't need to be there at the finish line, but you need to see what's happening usually in the middle. Well, to make a long story short, there's no clear answer. This GitHub repository shows how amazingly developed this is. There's actually no code, just in case you can't see the picture. This is not an answer that has been made. It's newer on the front end. We still are working on it, and that was the point of this conversation. The idea makes a lot of sense. The implementation needs a lot of work. So that is something that we can start kind of looking at as developers, either to help or to kind of think in our own projects. How do we put this together? How would we make it work? Where would we tie it in? In the example, they used Redux, so there's a nice central spot to do that. But with React hooks, which you just heard about today, if you didn't know before, those are spread all over. If you have context and use reducer, then you don't even have Redux at all. you have lost that central point, there's no central point anymore. So how do you make this work? There's no clear set rule or guideline yet, and that's still kind of to be discovered. So that's what I have on the full stack trace. Any questions on that topic? Perfect. I knew I did a good job. All right. Well, that wraps up our time and kind of our quick summary of React Rally. We will post a link to all of the videos, so if you want to go back and get more details on any of them or all of them, you're welcome to do that. They're all on YouTube, so you can get all the information directly from the presenters. Thank you guys for coming.